Hey there, friends, and welcome back to This Life Without Limits. I'm your host, Weston McWhorter, and on today's episode, I'm joined by writer, author, podcaster, amateur mountaineer, cycling enthusiast, and food culture chronicler Derek Beres. Derek is the co-author of Conspirituality, How New Age Conspiracy Theories Became a Health Threat, and the co-host of the Conspirituality Podcast. Derek and his colleagues began exploring the topic of the rise of conspiracy theories being propagated in the yoga and wellness communities right around the time that the COVID-19 pandemic began to take hold around the world. And their work serves as a cautionary tale for those who may be seeking support in communities and alternative health modalities that may not always be what they seem. Derek's experience as a longtime yoga instructor and his colleagues' survival of different cult communities give them a unique insider perspective on how the anti-vax movement and QAnon were able to build a groundswell of momentum and support within the alternative health and wellness world. And they shine a light on some of the main personalities pushing confusing or downright false information out to a vulnerable population. Personally, I became interested in their work due to my own desire to expand my knowledge of the subject matter and to hold myself to a high standard of integrity and intellectual rigor in my own work related to transformational embodiment and leadership coaching. I also really love feeling like I'm sitting in on an advanced behavioral psychology class when I read or listen to these guys. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Derek, and let's get into it. All right, well, I just want to welcome Derek Beres to This Life Without Limits. Good to see you, man.
You too, Weston. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, and I'm excited to get to know you a little bit better and what you're working on and all that kind of stuff, man. So thank you for your time. And, you know, I guess the best way for me to sort of drop into this conversation, because we're going to talk today about conspirituality for a little while. What that is, how that sort of manifested in your life, and just some ways that perhaps we can be mindful of where it's showing up in our lives, and just to sort of be aware of the truth or the non-truth of things that are sort of floating through our fields, man. So if that sounds good to you, my first question really is like, and I asked you this before when we were kind of getting to know each other a little bit, is like, what in the hell is going on in the world right now, man?
That's a big question. It looked at through the lens of conspirituality, though. I worked as a yoga instructor and I was involved in the wellness industry for decades of my life. And I also had this other role as a journalist. I started my career as a professional journalist, and I noticed, even when I was fully embedded in wellness communities, that there was a penchant for misinformation and hearsay to be treated as if it was truth. And there's always dangers with that. My degree from college is in comparative religions, and I think I just started to understand that people latch onto ideologies and then they sort of close themselves off from considering other ideologies. So as a religion reporter for the daily newspaper at my college, Rutgers University, I would go and I would talk to leaders from Buddhist communities and Jewish communities and Islam and Christianity, and they ran the gamut. And one thing that I noticed was that everyone thought that they had the right way to experience life. And in my own sort of experience, as I grew and was practicing yoga and looking for my own voice, I guess you can say, I just started thinking about that. And I'm like, well, if everyone thinks they have the right one, they're really not seeing they're not seeing the forest for the trees in this sense. And so I think we always live with that. We are tribal in a sense as individuals and as our communities. But it's really at moments of cultural inflection and trauma that you really find out who you are and what you believe. And I think the pandemic brought us to a self-reckoning about who we are as a society and as a people. And all of that misinformation I had kind of been clocking and tracking all those years on a small scale that wasn't that dangerous actually turned out to be quite dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting, man, because, I mean, this is the first time I'd heard of that term in particular, and I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit. But this really isn't a new phenomenon, right? And it's gotten me. I mean, after reading the book and certainly following you guys on social media, like this is not really a new phenomenon. And I got to believe that, like, if the internet existed when, the Spanish flu was around, or, the Spanish Inquisition, that we would be in a similar cultural situation, where it is that kind of like, this way is the quote unquote right way, and every other way is not right, I guess.
Oh, we have proof of that with the Spanish flu. There was anti-mask and anti-vax advocates during that time over 100 years ago, but they
Yeah.
didn't have social media. You're exactly correct.
Right.
Social media is just is a tool of communication that unfortunately not only spreads misinformation and disinformation much faster, but it also works in such a way that if you are slightly primed to believe some of that information, the algorithm is going to just bring you into a place where you get into confirmation bias, where all of a sudden your feed is filled with people who are saying these pieces of misinformation as truth.
Yeah.
And that outsized influence of whatever you're looking at on your screen is going to make you believe that that is what most people believe, when in fact, so much of what we sort of track and look at is a minority opinion, but because of the networks that we're in, it seems like a majority opinion. And the influencers who are sharing this misinformation know that. I mean, Mickey Willis just sent out an email today where he said 99.99% of Americans basically know that mask mandates shouldn't happen again now because there's an uptick in COVID. He has no data supporting that. There's nothing in the world that many people in this country believe in and unified. But he can say those things because his network is so small and closed-minded that he'll say it and then people will actually believe it. And that's indicative of the communication networks that we haven't really figured out how to use yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true, man. And I mean, here we are. So I guess I'll say this, like, the first time I really kind of became aware of the danger of this was around 9/11, right? And a lot of the conspiracy theories that were floating around after that happened. And that was just like, the internet was sort of in its infancy in 2001, which sounds crazy to even say, but I didn't have a Facebook account in 2001. It hadn't even really been delivered to the world yet. But thinking about that, thinking about the fires that are recently happening in Maui, it's like it's almost like disaster. I mean, it's like disaster capitalism and disaster, like, paranoia, all in one fell swoop, right?
Well, and if we had cell phones with video cameras on 9/11, it would be a much different experience. I had a flip phone, and I specifically remember walking out and turning and walking up 6th Avenue and seeing everyone looking in the other direction. And I stopped and I turned, and a guy was sitting there on a flip phone, and he was the guy. I was like, "What's going on?" And he told me, and then I look and I see it all in action. The technology. And then I go actually to my office where I was a magazine editor at the time, and I log onto the internet to try to find out what's happening a few miles from where I'm sitting at that time.
Yeah.
At the time, the network effects weren't there to spread that information as quickly. And, in some ways, it might have been nice for more people to have immediate cameras there to get more information, good information out at the time because of how tragic it is. But the 9/11 truthers, which started shortly after, yeah, it was probably one of my first instances of seeing that sort of paranoia. I almost couldn't believe it, especially having been there and seen it with my eyes. Now, of course, I don't have intel on what the government is doing, and of course, we do have instances. You said disaster capitalism, Naomi Klein's term, of bad, of very unfortunate planned events that have happened in other democracies or other nations throughout the 20th century and probably before that. But we do have our own eyes that we can see what happens. And what is more frustrating now is I have come across influencers who were just born or not alive yet at that time, talking about trutherism. And maybe it's just showing my age, but that also just reminds me of how quickly bad information spreads and takes over people's brains.
Yeah, it's really true, man. And I was thinking, like, as I was reading the book, there is a really a even darker side to some of these conspiracy theories that could get put forth. And in particular, you guys talk a lot about anti-Semitism and racism in the Conspirituality book, and how that kind of plays, into some of the fear that gets put out there. And I'm just curious, like, what you've seen specifically kind of in that realm, and maybe like why that is such what seems to be a common theme.
I think that there's a lack of a lot of things. One of my projects I'm working on now is really science and media literacy. And there's a lack of science literacy. There's a lack of media literacy. And a lot of the programs and organizations around it are geared toward classrooms and younger children. And I've realized that as I'm working on my new book and going through these topics, that most adults think they have good media literacy and diets and scientific understanding, and they think they know where to look for information. But there's the phrase, do your own research. And if you actually did your own research, you would actually be able to find 10 or 12 different points of view on a topic, and then look at the history of them and then try to weigh them out, because research isn't something that can be done in an hour or 5 minutes or even a day. It takes a lot of time. And that's why we have experts on the podcast all the time, because these are people who actually go through that process. But with anti-Semitism and racism specifically, I think it's a really poor understanding of history and how historical forces create societies. So recently I learned about a guy, and I don't know much about him, but his name is Alex Hermosi, and he's an entrepreneur who sold a gym business, and now he runs this acquisition company where he funds businesses. And, he has a new book out that is all about sales and marketing, and that's all fine. But he was on Chris Williamson's podcast where he compared the hustle that it takes to be a successful businessman with slaves.
Wow.
And he actually made this argument that, slaveries didn't get to choose the work that they did, but they were working all the time. So it just shows that humans can work all the time if they really put their mind to it. And I share that on our channel, not just to show how ludicrous and unfeeling a statement that is, but it also just shows someone who actually doesn't understand anything about the historical forces that created American society that we all live in right now. We saw that with anti-CRT on the right, and for years with them not actually understanding what the messaging behind critical race theory means. And anti-Semitism, and we're having Mike Rothschild on our podcast again in a couple of weeks. He has a new book called Jewish Space Lasers, which just talks about the centuries-long misinformation about the Rothschilds. He's not related to them, but the Rothschilds and banking, and why Jews got into banking in the first place, which isn't a good story. Right. There's so much, but overall, I think it's just because stereotypes and tropes are easy for brains to process. We like simple ideas. If there's one group that is causing all the problems, that's a lot easier for our brains to think about than the multivariate influences that actually create a structured society. And people will fall into those tropes very easily because they don't have to think too much about them.
Yeah. And I mean, I was actually just thinking that that's something that I really appreciate about the book that you and Matthew and Julian put together, because it is a very intellectual book on the surface, like listening to it and even reading through your, the Instagram feed and listening to the podcast. Like, there is a very intellectual, almost requirement to kind of be curious and sort of follow what you guys are doing, And I mean, I guess the question is and maybe we've already answered this, is what do you think it would take to shift the cultural kind of default mode from this just give me fast food, or just, give me some. I mean, when I was growing up, it was like, hungry man dinner, something that was easy. I don't want to think about dinner tonight. Like, what do you think is some of the requirements to shift us from that, like, easy to digest, easy to consume, I don't want to think too much about it, to something where people are actually curious about understanding media, understanding science and technology, and all the other things that I feel like are kind of required to at least like move our society and our culture, I mean, like the world as a whole, in a more positive direction.
I don't think there's any way to do that on a mass level. There's no way to scale that sort of sentiment. It's impossible. Then I am always allergic to making any sort of silver bullet predictions of what can do that. But you can change minds on a person to person basis, and usually you have to know that person. Yeah. And it sounds defeating, but it's just true. It's how we operate and it's how we function. I've long said that the ways that we interact on social media is not how most people would interact in real life situations. Yeah. The things that people say to one another, they're not going to say that if they're face to face looking at someone in the eyes. Some of them might. There are psychopaths, and there are people who don't have empathy at all.
Yeah.
But most people would actually cower if they have that sort of online identity. They would cower in the face of actual conflict with someone else, or better, they would actually learn because they would have that physical relationship with someone and read their pantomimes and hear their voice, and not only the other person's voice in their head. Yeah. So unfortunately, for that sort of change to happen, it has to affect the individual in a way. So I think the closest we have George Floyd, and we have the anti-abortion, the overturning of Roe v. Wade to point to. You do have peak events that actually inspire people to action, but kind of like my theory on psychedelics, that psychedelics are very powerful, but the real work is done in sobriety. You can take that peak event and then you have to actually work at it for the rest of your life. Yeah. The same thing happens with a Roe v. Wade. Like, who are still out there fighting for abortion rights? Who is out there fighting for racial justice? The real work is mundane. It's tiring. It takes work. There's a lot of steps backwards, but that when that peak event happens and something changes in your life, you then have the option of realizing, oh, this has been a problem. Now I have to be part of the solution. Yeah. And that I see as much more likely to affect change than any sort of one thing in these communication networks we use.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's something that's kind of been resonant for me in the work that I do with individuals and small groups is, looking, like, really kind of digging in with people and trying to determine, what their values are, what their core values are, right? What creates meaning for them in their lives. And I think for me, that's, the people that I've come across, again, like in psychedelic journeys, where, people that are like really stuck in a particular mindset have, almost this lack of an understanding of like what's most important to them as an individual, right? And I have two kids, one in college and one just sophomore in high school, and I think a lot about the curriculum that's available to them, and how cool it would be if they were studying, if psychology was less of an elective and something more like just basic psychological courses, even around like nonviolent communication and, inner child work, things like that might, help plant some seeds of empathy, right? Because I do think that's a great point, that, people feel like they get lost, or I feel like people get lost in these hyper dramatic narratives without a real understanding or an ability to discern truth, right? From, let's just call it like 4 different sources. You don't even have to have 12, right? Just 4 different opinions on a particular subject. We can just call it mask mandates, right? Just for, timeliness. So yeah, I mean, I think about, how do we begin to kind of, educate or just illuminate in people the importance of that quality of like discernment,
Well, a class on cognitive biases would be helpful for everyone, but then a layer deeper, a class on understanding their own cognitive biases,
Yeah.
because we all have them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing. I worked in for a financial company for about a year, and part of my role was understanding cognitive biases, writing about them, and showing how they affect people's financial lives.
Right.
And there's one thing to be able to understand what a cognitive bias is, like a confirmation bias, a simple one like that. But then understanding how you partake in your own confirmation bias is more illuminating than just understanding the bias itself. So that would be a good first step, and at least recognizing your own limitations more than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of self-inquiry is, I mean, that for me has been, my own path of self-healing, my own path of growth, right? Is like, why for, X amount of years of my life did I think a certain way, or did I react in a certain situation, or did I react a certain way in a situation? And to try and, just move the needle a little bit, so that personally, like, less reactive or less judgmental or less, triggered by, something that might happen that is really, outside of my control, I guess.
Well, a self-imposed rule that I've instituted a few years ago, especially with the podcast, is I don't ever share an article without reading it.
Mm.
And depending on the source, but most often I also then go look for a secondary source before sharing the first article, just to make sure that it's legitimate. And I don't think most people do that.
Yeah.
Because most people don't read. I've shared articles before and I've gotten pushback. And then I said, but what you're saying is actually in the article. And then you find out, oh, I didn't read it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe it's just my own training, but I don't share something to engage in dialogues if people aren't going to at least meet me at that base level of engaging with the content that's being shared before replying. But that's not the medium doesn't allow for it if you're not trained that way, or if you don't train yourself that way.
Yeah.
But I find it very important, because sometimes there's something that grabbed my attention and I was like, oh, that's terrible, let me share it. And then I read it, and then I looked for another source, and I'm like, oh, you know what? This is a little clickbaity. It doesn't really tell the whole story, so I'm not going to share it. And from my perspective, that just helps me save face, but it also doesn't partake in spreading bad information around.
Yeah. 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 Beautiful, man. So let's just talk about conspirituality for a second, because I would imagine that a lot of people that are going to watch this or listen to it might not be familiar with that term or the book. And so I just wanted, to kind of like, what's the definition? Where did you guys, so the idea sort of originate from? I know it sort of started to kind of like gel together at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, but yeah, just talk a little bit about that and how it has metastasized over the last 3 years.
The term itself, the first origin of the word seems to be a Canadian rap group in 2008 that called themselves Conspirituality. They still exist. I came across it in early 2020 when British philosopher Jules Evans wrote a Medium article about it, citing a 2011 academic paper by Charlotte Ward and David Voas. I then wrote a piece for it for a website called Big Think that I used to work for. And then that became the title of the name of our podcast a few months later, when we decided to actually make this a field of study and inquiry for ourselves. The term, basically, the way that Ward positions it is that there is this intersection between the predominantly female, left-leaning, liberal wellness New Agers and the predominantly male conspiracy theorists on the right, and how they sort of horseshoe together. She has said that there is historical precedent for it. I have found that it reoccurs, especially during periods of cultural trauma. So the last time that you really saw it was in the late 1960s, when you had some of the hippies siding with the John Birch Society around issues like fluoride in the drinking water. Right. Of course, with the pandemic, the stakes are a lot higher, it seems. Not that at that time, obviously, civil rights and feminism were very high stakes. You just didn't see as much conspiracy mongering at the time. But now with the pandemic, you see a lot more of it. So that's what the term means. As it turns out, Charlotte Ward herself is a conspiracy theorist. The rap group also seems to broker in conspiracy theories. So it seems pretty interesting that the people that coined the term basically broker in conspiracy theories themselves. We have tried to flesh it out and progress the field a little bit more. It brings me a lot of joy that the book that you've read has been cited in a few academic papers already. So you said earlier, yes, there is a certain level. I don't think we are a 101 podcast. We do 101 episodes very specifically to introduce people to the concepts. But I would say we try to be more of a 201, meaning you have to have some knowledge of this field before entering. But not everything is 101. And we tried to be very clear on what we offer and what we don't offer.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that, that, I mean, to your point of trying to elevate thought a little bit, whether you're pulling people into that, that space of like, oh, I actually kind of need to think a little bit about what I'm consuming or what I'm reading or what I'm allowing into, just kind of my psyche on a regular basis. I think it was a great read. It's certainly entertaining. And yeah, I mean, I guess if you can, on, to not really dumb it down to a 101 course, but like, what are people, what's out there that people need to keep an eye out for, in terms of what you've seen and experienced and yeah.
Well, no, let me be clear. I have no problem with 101. I think 101 is extremely important in the work that we do. And there are parts of the book and in our podcast, like I said, I mean, you have to introduce people to concepts. I'm just saying on a weekly basis, if you tune in, all of a sudden, some of the episodes are not starting at that place.
Yeah.
One heuristic that I developed very early in the podcast that I've stuck with is watch what they say and watch what they sell. And an example of that is someone who is a wellness influencer and they come out and they say the vaccine is a bioweapon or it doesn't work, or they just make up all of these sort of right-wing leaning talking points about vaccination that are not true. And they say this and then they follow it up with, but I have a supplement that I'm selling that actually does help protect against COVID or helps alleviate some of the COVID systems. I have a breathing workshop that I'm teaching because COVID is a respiratory illness. And if you're good with breath work, then you won't fall victim to COVID. That is the basic one. So the two main ones is if they're saying something and then they're selling something, that's a big red flag. And the other thing, and I think this applies more broadly than conspirituality, I think this comes across all sorts of spiritual domains and all sorts of wellness marketing, is if someone is specifically saying they found the single problem with whatever, that's also a problem. Because as we were talking earlier, like there's a nuance in everything in existence, and there are many arguments for all sorts of different ideas. So whenever I see someone say that even something that I believe in and care about, like wealth inequality, when they say wealth inequality happens because of this and that's the reason, I'm like, no, it's not. There's 5 or 6 reasons that you haven't even touched upon. So our brains like easy answers, but anytime someone's offering one problem and one solution, that is a huge red flag for me.
Yeah. Understand that for sure. And so, some of the influencers that you've, talked about, I mean, I'll be honest with you, man, when I was coming kind of out of the dark night of my soul back in 2018, there were a lot of folks that you mentioned in the book who just, showed up in my Instagram feed. I kind of like gravitated towards some of the thoughts that were in there, and in some ways was a little surprised to see them mentioned in the book, but also like once the discussion happens and once it's kind of illuminated a little bit more around, what particularly is problematic around their particular point of view or their particular approach, it makes a lot more sense, and I mean, in particular, I was thinking about, I mean, for me, like Zach Bush was a guy that I kind of like, heard some podcasts and I was like, wow, that's actually kind of cool. Like there's an aspect of what he's talking about that I can really get down with, and this was, this was probably 2019, maybe. And to be honest with you, after a while, I kind of like with a lot of these folks, I kind of end up sort of tailing off interest, for whatever reason. I mean, it could be because I don't desire to be sold to, but I think that's one of those things that like, and you guys talk about this in the book, that there's like, there's a relatability component to some of these individuals. There's a charismatic component to some of these individuals. There's almost a really sweet, subtle sense that they care, and they know me and they know my struggle. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those folks and kind of like what that looks like.
I would say that most of the people we cover, there's points that I agree with them fully on.
Yeah.
I probably not the channelers, because I think channeling is nonsense. So anything that's coming out of that sort of world is not going to, I'm not going to be able to agree with. And most of what they say is so ambiguous and benign anyway. But when you get to like a Zach Bush, I don't know a lot about regenerative agriculture, so I'm not going to say I agree with him on these things. But when he talks about things like there being problems with the food and agriculture industry, I'm fully on board with that.
Yeah.
And if he has certain regenerative practices that have to do with recovering the soil and actually using crop rotation, I can probably agree with that from my limited knowledge of that space and having reported on that issue back in the 90s when I used to work for newspapers.
Yeah.
But when you then get to viruses don't cause diseases, there are a billion times whatever billion viruses in the sand, and so it's actually the terrain that makes you sick. You see part of an argument that makes sense, which is, of course, your environment affects your health,
right,
but you can be the healthiest person alive and a virus can still take you down.
Yeah.
And that is where I run into problems with someone like a Zach Bush, because he will then say virus theories, nonsense. Terrain theory is where it's at. Beauchamp was correct in that, even though Pasteur won that argument.
Right.
Oh, and then come to my M clinic where I'm selling phase angle healing,
right,
and all of these other interventions. And the M clinic doesn't exist anymore. He's now gone off into the workshop circuit. But at the time, that's what he was doing. And that is what we try to highlight. Or you have someone like Joe Dispenza, who is a chiropractor, and the chiropractic school that he studied at eventually got disbarred because it was teaching straight chiropractic, which is nonsense. And he was the staff chiropractor for Rumptha, which is a 35,000-year-old demon god or whatever that is.
Right.
And that's what he was starting with. And he calls himself a neuroscientist. You can go to different social media entities as he says neuroscientist. We did a lot of research trying to find where he got his neuroscience training. Doesn't appear to have him. One thing I know about neuroscientists is that they're very proud of their accomplishments and they'll list them. And so you have someone who's talking about the importance of breath work and meditation, which is totally true. Can it relieve anxiety and stress and make you feel more clear? Absolutely. Then you get to, I've seen people who are paralyzed walk, and I've seen people overcome cancer through these workshops. Yeah. That's where I'm going to have a real problem. And that's why we cover those people, because they say a lot of things that sound nice and could be true. And then you keep going in their program and you get to a very dark place.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally get that, man. And relate. And I again, Dispenza was one of the ones that I bought a couple of books, dove in there, found some relatability, but again, there does seem to be, almost it was like esoterically inaccessible in some places, where you're just like, God, like, okay, I can't even really actually understand like how this works, and so for me, that was a little bit of a red flag, and kind of like why I sort of set that down, so I guess my question coming out of that is like, I'm just going to ask this simply, is like, is there room in this world for miracles?
How do you define miracles?
Yeah. So I was just thinking, right, because you come from a comparative religion background. I also grew up in the evangelical Christian church, and And so there's a part of me that's like, okay, God is out there somewhere, right? Like crazy things have happened throughout human history, right? Maybe they're explainable, maybe they're not necessarily explainable. The universe is so vast. And like, if you believe that, right? Like if you can believe that like the Webb telescope can look back to like the dawn of time, then who's to say that like a miracle, like a health miracle can't happen? And I'm just asking that sort of to be devil's advocate a little bit, because I do think it's like, it's kind of fun to sort of think about that in some ways, but not be latched onto it. You know what I mean?
Well, the challenge for me with this sort of question is that if you don't identify what the miracle is, I can't really respond.
Yeah, sure.
Because if you're gonna say someone walked on water, I'm gonna say I'd have to see it. Like that just because someone wrote it down a few thousand years ago does not mean at all that it happened and that I have any faith that it happened.
Yeah.
Now, if you're talking about someone who was diagnosed with cancer and they were going to die within a year and they lived 5 years later, that's a biological process that we've seen happen before. And I can't speak to the reasons why they're still alive, but we have data that people have been able to overcome that and have surprise doctors. And that's totally, I think, possible.
Yeah.
Whether or not you call it a miracle or just good health or good luck, is up for debate. So, I mean, if you want to drill down on specifics, I'm game to try. But like the broader idea that things that can't be explained happen on some level, sure, there's plenty we can't explain. But then if you're going to add in an outside agency that is allowing for that because that person prayed enough or thought in a certain way, I'm going to be more skeptical.
Yeah. And or taking credit for whatever happened to that person, right? I mean, I'm thinking about like, the evangelical preachers that would run around and do like, tent revivals in the summer times, and perform healing miracles and things like that, right? Yeah, I only ask just because like it was something that's come up for me a couple of times, whether it's listening to the podcast or even reading the book, was like, wait a minute, like I want to believe that some miraculous shit can happen in this world, and that for me, like, I guess that feels a little bit important to my own spiritual path. And maybe that's, I'll take that one, but I thought I would bring it up just because it felt a little resonant to me, so.
I am, and I've talked about this often, but I'm an atheist, and that partly happened because I studied comparative religions.
Yeah.
Because I kept coming across different communities of people who thought that they were right, and I was like, if everyone thinks that, and then you get into the more wellness ideology of like, it doesn't matter what you call it, and I don't know. I guess as a writer, I think naming things is pretty important for comprehension between people.
Sure.
So I also don't really get around with that sort of definition.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean I very much like the work of V.S. Ramachandran, who writes beautifully about the miraculous nature and just how much we don't understand and how much awe you can find by studying physics or by studying biology, which is where I really find rapture when I'm able to read science history textbooks and put pieces together. Like that brings me into a state of bliss. So I understand the terminology. I think though, it's really hard to pin down because there's a lot of ambiguity in the language as presented by a lot of wellness.
Yeah, for sure, man. And I think that, I want to have a lot of faith in humanity, right? And it seems sometimes really difficult to hang on to that when, there is so much, like strife and trauma and everything that's circling around. And certainly part of the reason why I, exited my religious framework when I was a kid was because for those same reasons, right? Like how could this be the only way, right? Or how could this be the only path? It just never really resonated with me, and frankly, I think it was probably like one of the most liberating and probably like spiritually explosive decisions I ever made, which take that for what it is,
Well, given current polling with evangelicals and Trump still, after all these years, like that community has always befuddled me in a lot of ways. And I've read extensively about the tent revivals and the two major revivals that have happened, and the ways that they've bent religious liberties around over the course of history. I'll give you a good example of kind of talking about the broader parameters of what we're discussing. I remember when I was heavily involved in the yoga community in New York City in the early aughts, that there would be things like meditations for world peace. And so you'd go into a yoga studio and you would sit there for an hour or two, someone give a Dharma talk, and then you'd meditate. And the idea was that you were sending your energy out to heal Israel or Tibet or whatever it was at that time. And I came to realize that only makes the people in the room feel good. It makes their nervous systems feel aligned, or, puts them in better touch with themselves. Yeah. Now, if that event then inspired you to go donate money to those causes, I would say that is a better example of how you actually make a real world impact. But if you just went in there and you meditated and you felt better, but then you left and didn't do anything, well, that's the sort of selfish, individualistic spirituality that I think we try to talk about on our podcast, because it hasn't actually made an impact in the world. So to me, these practices can lead you into different forms of activism, which actually do good things in the world. And if you want to attribute that to your religion or your spirituality, I've always felt that religious communities doing charitable acts is the best examples of religion, and why I'm not like against religion. It's the metaphysics that are really troublesome to me, because the metaphysics allow you to think things are happening that don't actually have any real world impact.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. So I just want to shift gears a little bit to talk about psychedelics for a second, right? You have a book called Hero's Dose that you wrote. It came out in 2020. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I was just curious how you feel like the psychedelic medicine community folds into this broader like spiritual awakening or milieu that we find ourselves in right now, and is there anything in the use of psychedelics, especially with some intention, whether it be in therapeutic settings or in ritual settings, that can help kind of bridge gaps or provide gateways into deeper self-awareness in order to inspire those actions?
I'll start on a good note on this one, which is that I'm a big fan of psychedelics. I've been doing them for 30 years now. Next year will be 30 years. I don't do them as frequently. I definitely did too much in college. And I talk about some of those experiences in the book, combining them and going a little overboard. That said, just earlier this week, or last week actually, I microdosed LSD and took a very light cannabis edible and went into a float tank. I haven't been in one since before the pandemic. There was this minor health scare in my family, and things worked out and everything's good, but it was a very stressful time. And I did that little ritual on my own, and it felt amazing. And it really cleared up some things in my head, and I've been in a much better state ever since. Yeah. Now, it's a minor anecdote, but there have been much more intensive periods of my life where I felt psychedelics were very useful. I am fully on board with psychedelics for ritual use. I am fully on board with psychedelics for personal use. And I think that the therapeutic use that is growing, the movement around it, I am all for. But my problem is that there's going to be charlatans and grifters moving in. We've already seen that happen in the therapeutic space with all the money from Silicon Valley flowing in and the rushed approvals of the ketamine trials. The Janssen Therapeutics, their trials were people actually committed suicide who were not suicidal before starting ketamine, and they were taken off the ketamine. They committed suicide. That was the FDA trial that was approved. Wow. And Janssen said that was indicative of their prior suicidal ideation when those people had none before they started and then stopped the protocol. So I think the FDA allowing that is really shitty. And I feel like a lot of people are looking that. And so you have companies like Field Trip, who I've known Ronan. I was just on his podcast and I like him a lot, but I think he scaled too quickly. There was another company that scaled that tried to bring it to the masses really quickly. And now what you have is they shut down a bunch of clinics, and you have a lot of veterans, for example, who are using it, who are now like in that same situation where they didn't even get to taper. All of a sudden their clinics were shut down. And that is my problem with the capitalist drive behind psychedelic therapy right now. So I hope that companies take that into consideration, because I'm all for them moving forward intelligently. And on the ritual space, we're already seeing instances of yoga teachers who've done psychedelics once or twice and now call themselves shamans, and they're leading ceremonies. And I think that can be really dangerous, because people who are not prepared to have someone in their circle who has a mental breakdown and they don't know what to do, there's going to be problems with that. So again, I can't speak, because when I was doing it in the 90s, it was all friends who were just doing it with friends. And we did have bad periods, but we had a network of people who were able to help. But the way that it's growing and scaling right now, and people who don't have experience with these psychedelics, they don't know how to deal with people with real mental health issues. So I just warrant caution in all of these different situations, while also maintaining hope that people find healing with these substances, because I think that that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so just sort of speaking on that, like what I'm hearing is there is again, like if someone was thinking about, using psilocybin or MDMA or ketamine or ayahuasca, whatever, right? LSD to resolve whatever trauma that they may be holding, that there is like you want to do your research, right? Again, to your point, like whether it's a medicine community that you're going to sit with, or a therapist that you're going to engage for that kind of work. What are some of the things that you've seen out there that kind of are throw up red flags that people could be, kind of on the lookout for?
Well, a friend of mine was just talking about an experience she did recently with silomethazone. Silomethazine.
Okay.
And this is a church that began in Austin recently, veterans who started it, who have claimed that they have found or created a certain molecule that's a cross between psilocybin and the Cambo, or one frog medicine. I'm not sure which one. And it was originally identified by Alexander Shulgin, but he never was able to use it, or he was never able to isolate it. And so they had their first big ritual in Austin, and it's marketed as giving you this very calming experience without all the visuals and hallucinations of psilocybin. Now, the thing about it, in Symposia, which I'm a big fan of their website, they've done some work on this, that when the pills that they've been sending out to people were tested, none of the actual ingredient that they claim is in there, but they did find psilocybin. So it appears that they're just selling mushrooms under another name at a very expensive price for people, and then creating a sort of a container around it, making promises that don't actually match up to what they're stating. Now, this is all in the news right now, and it's ongoing, but it is an example of where I go to their website and I look at the church's very libertarian, very Texan, like sort of language around the freedom of the individual and sovereignty, and they're not providing what they claim to be. So that's just a recent example of some of the shadiness that can go on. And I think that's really unfortunate, because it then takes away from people who are doing really good work in these spaces, when you have sort of not conspiracies, just bad marketing and bad intentions behind. And apparently it was started by veterans who were trying to heal their own PTSD. So it's not like it started with bad intentions, but somewhere along the way, they've decided to get a little manipulative, and that always leads to bad places.
Yeah, for sure. We talked, like when you and I were getting to know each other, we talked a little bit about integration, right? Um, and I think actually the first time we were going to talk, I had to reschedule a call because I was in an integration, like a post-ceremony integration session that was running long, and for me, that feels like a place, and this also goes to what we were speaking about earlier of like, the having a peak experience, and then like, what do you do after that? Whether it's, meditating for world peace, and then like, what's the integration? What's the real world application of that in your life that creates like a transformation in yourself? So I'm just curious if that's something that, you have, experienced, and or if you feel like what would be the qualities, I guess, of a really solid integration program, like a post journey, post ritual holding of an individual who may have had for their first like psychedelic experience something that they just really can't even believe. Lots of inspiration, lots of insight coming through on the medicine, and then what do they do with that afterwards?
Well, a lot of the programs that are developing in psychedelic therapy, there are multiple free experience sessions that are psychiatry basically, and then there's a session, and then there's some follow-ups.
Yeah.
And if you find a therapist where that model works, then that is good. And if that therapist is good, and I know some people training who I consider upstanding people, that's going to be a good model for people. But I think at the bigger point, what you're getting at is it goes back to forget the psychedelics. It's like, do you have a good support network?
Yeah.
Because that therapist is going to be there the next day or when you're coming down. But in 3 days, when something that happened during an experience clicks and you need someone to talk to, and you don't have the money for the therapist, or they're not available at that moment, do you have a partner? Do you have a family member? Do you have a friend?
Yeah.
And I think in general, I mean, that's just life in general.
Yeah.
Right. I feel very lucky that I have a really strong network of friends. And I think that actually helped me, because when I was getting deep into yoga, into these spiritual spaces, most of my network of friends they don't deal with any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So they would hold me accountable when I would say something and be like, hold on a second. And we talk about it, and having those sorts of networks of people who don't agree with you on everything, but that trust you and you trust them. And like, my best friend is cynical as hell and he's skeptical, and sometimes that's to his detriment, but sometimes that's a really powerful quality. Having that in your life is really important. So I think for someone coming out of that experience, having support, but also having that sort of foundational person or people that you can turn to and that can push back on you and challenge you, that's really valuable. And if you don't have that and you go into these experiences, just understand, it could actually create more confusion than clarity.
Yeah.
Because I can still remember right now as we're talking, I haven't done ayahuasca in coming up 5 years now. But I can still remember some of the lessons from that and how I'm still working through them in my life now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it is really beautiful. I came to, psychedelics pretty late in my life, a little bit of a late bloomer, but a lot of the work where I felt like in my, again, my post sort of trauma state after 2018, I was stuck in a lot of places, and having those little pieces kind of like, carved away just to, to be clarified in some ways was not only really like helpful and beautiful, but that, to your point, it's like every day is a practice, right? Of like, how am I going to integrate that insight that happened a year and a half ago, today? And so, I really appreciate that point, of having the network, doing your research ahead of time. I've always been really suspicious of, individuals that make certain promises about what can or could happen during, a certain medicine ceremony. That always feels a little, disingenuous to me as well. And speaking of which, I think, we're kind of getting close to the end here, but I did just want to touch a second on the upcoming election cycle, because whoa boy, we're in for another wild ride, I think. And so Who's out there? I mean, is there anybody out there you like right now, man? Or is everybody just kind of like, is it a hurricane of misinformation and craziness?
I mean, at the moment, the only person I could see moving forward is Biden. I
Yeah.
mean, that's really it. I 2016, 2020, I primaried with Bernie.
Mm.
I still am frustrated that there wasn't more momentum. I'm still frustrated that the DNC kind of blocked him, especially in 2016, because we saw how that turned out.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be a serious reckoning with liberals and with Democrat like institutionalists, especially because it's really frustrating that they just set up this sort of blockade around Biden, especially when he ran on being one term.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't think he gets enough credit for what he's done. And that's really frustrating too, because take away all of your feelings and just look at policies and what he's done or tried to do. Not all of them, because he's allowing drilling in Alaska, which I have a big problem with.
Sure.
But he's also put forward a lot of good stuff. There's nothing on the Republican side. It is a shit show. Yeah. Like watching that last election, seeing Vivek Ramaswamy, one of the biggest conspiracy theorists, get a bump and finish like some people thought first or third in that. We are in uncharted territory right now, and whatever happens, and at the current course that's happening, it's Biden versus Trump again, and Biden wins. That's just right now. Who knows what's going to happen? So I'm not making a prediction. But even if that plays out, the amount of paranoia and misinformation that's going to be around everything over the next year, I really fear for the sort of isolated upticks in violent incidents that are going to happen. Yeah. I kind of feel like I don't think America is going to have another civil war on a national scale, but I do believe experts who think that violence on a small scale, like we've just seen in Jacksonville, like more of that is going to happen. Yeah. And that makes me very fearful, because that is exactly the path we're taking at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it is almost like, these isolated regional skirmishes, and or a Cold War within the nation, around like really disparate ideologies that, I mean, like I said, I got a lot of hope for humanity, but it does seem like we're in for a really bumpy ride over the next year, and I'm grateful that guys like you and Matthew and Julian are out there like elevating the conversation around this stuff. I really appreciate the time and the thought that you put in, and just kind of in kind of landing the plane here. And I'll totally shift gears and just say, like, what are you really excited about right now, man?
On a personal level,
yes, on a personal level.
On a personal level, I'm going to summit Mount St. Helens next month. In a couple weeks now. So I've been training for that. It's not the most rigorous of climbs, but I am not a mountaineer. And I moved to Oregon specifically to spend more time on trails and on my bike. I get to get out on my bike. I have a minimum of 75 miles a week that I set my goal for this year. So I do that, and I've held it every week this year or more. I've done some pretty long rides. It is the best way to get to know a terrain. Yeah. And this state is just beautiful. So the fact that I get to spend a lot more time outside than I did when I lived in Los Angeles or New York, and that I get to go to eat at wonderful restaurants with my wife as much as we can afford and get out. And this is a food cart city. So we spend a lot of times at carts. I've actually just started a separate Substack focused on the diverse cuisine of 82nd Avenue of Portland, just for fun. I used to do food writing a long time ago, so I'm excited about that. And just to continue to work with these two. I mean, we signed a 3-year deal with our podcasting agency earlier this year. So we're in it for the long haul. And I have a new book on science and media literacy I'm writing right now, and all these projects with these guys. So on a very personal level, it feels like there's something that is very appealing to me about researching something for many years and getting clearer and clearer on how to talk about it and present it and fight back against it. Yeah. That inspires me to get to my computer every day. So those are the biggest things in my life right now.
I love it, man. Yeah, I love it. And frankly, Derek, I'm just really glad that we've gotten to know each other a little bit, man. And I'm grateful that you took the time to share your knowledge and your insight around this subject matter. And I'll just put it out there that I hope we get to ride bikes together one of these days, man.
Yeah, I hope so. I don't usually travel with one, but I know I will be in your area again, probably next year. So they're definitely possible.
Or, honestly, like I need to get out west again, man. It's been way too long. So, well, man, I really appreciate your time. I hope you have a great rest of your week, Derek. And I'm going to link up I'm going to connect with you and link up all the places people can find you and Matthew and Julian online so that we make sure that people can find you.
Perfect. Thank you, Weston.
Yeah, you bet, man. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye. That's it for this episode of This Life Without Limits. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and will join me again for future episodes. If you want to stay updated on new releases, hit the subscribe button below, and don't forget to check out the show notes for additional details and links. I'd also love to hear what you think about the content of this episode, so please feel welcome to drop any comments, thoughts, questions, critique, any of that below. Thanks again for joining me, and I look forward to next time. Until then, here's to a life without limits, my friends.